When the thermometer fell past -36, the woodshed might as well have been on the far side of the moon. It was only 96 feet from Mara Delaney's cabin. 96 feet of open Idaho snow. 96 feet between the stove that could keep her alive and the fuel that stove had to eat every few hours. Mara had two choices: freeze inside a cabin her ex-husband had given her as a joke, or build a hallway through winter itself. She built the hallway. The divorce was final on a wet Friday morning in Boise County. By sunset, Mara owned almost nothing that could fit into a bank account. For 18 months, her ex-husband, Cole Rusk, had turned their marriage into a paper war. Cole did not shout. He did not throw plates. He smiled, hired men in dark suits, and let documents do the damage. The business they started together was suddenly his separate asset. Their savings had vanished into loans, consulting fees, and accounts Mara's lawyer could not reach without money Mara no longer had. What she got was a dented 1994 Dodge Dakota, 3 plastic tubs of clothes, a box of kitchen pans, and a quitclaim deed to a place Cole called the Family Retreat. He said it in the courthouse hallway, with that careful little grin he used when he wanted to sound generous. "Needle Creek is yours now," he told her. "Plenty of quiet, plenty of space to think." Then he leaned closer. "Try not to burn it down." Needle Creek was not a retreat. It was 11 acres of steep timbered ground in the high country of central Idaho, almost 7,000 feet up, with an old prospector's cabin crouched under the pines, and a leaning woodshed on the far side of a clearing. The cabin had no power, no plumbing, no insulation worth naming, and no one close enough to hear a scream. Cole's great-grandfather had once worked a small placer claim there. After that, the land had been forgotten, passed down as a tax nuisance no one bothered to visit. Cole had kept it because it cost almost nothing. Then, when he wanted to look merciful in court, he handed it to Mara. She drove up on November 3rd with $462 left, a cooler full of canned food, a sack of rice, a sack of beans, a kerosene lantern, 2 jugs of water, a second-hand sleeping bag, and the kind of silence that comes after rage burns itself out. The road ended in ruts. The trees stood black and bare against a pewter sky. The air smelled metallic, the way it does before snow decides to stop threatening and start taking. The cabin was worse than Cole's photographs. The porch bowed in the middle. The door dragged across the floor. One window was patched with cloudy plastic. Mouse droppings peppered the shelf above the sink, though there was no running water for the sink to serve. But in the center of the one-room cabin sat a heavy iron stove, old, ugly, beautiful. Mara knelt in front of it and opened the firebox. Ash from some winter long before hers drifted across her knuckles. A stove meant heat, heat meant time, and time meant Cole had not finished her. She stepped back outside and crossed the clearing toward the woodshed. It stood 96 feet away, built from rough cedar poles and weathered boards, half swallowed by brush. The sliding door had swollen shut. Mara pried it open with a tire iron from the truck. Inside, she found what looked, for one breath, like salvation. Firewood, not a few stacks, walls of it, split pine near the front, tamarack and fir toward the middle. Heavy rounds of old larch stacked deep in the back, dry as bone under the sagging roof. Whoever had cut it had meant to live through more than one winter. Mara laughed once, sharp and unbelieving. The sound came out too close to a sob. She carried the first armload back to the cabin, lit the stove, and watched orange light bloom behind the grate. That first hour, the cabin changed. The board stopped biting through her socks. Frost loosened from the window. The iron belly of the stove radiated heat into the room until Mara sat cross-legged on the floor with both hands around a chipped mug of instant coffee, feeling her body remember that it belonged to the living. Then the radio started talking. The voice came through in broken pieces, but enough of it was clear. A deep Arctic system was dropping into the northern Rockies. The county was warning all remote residents to leave or prepare for full isolation. Snowfall would be measured in feet. Wind gusts could bury open ground in minutes. Overnight temperatures were expected to fall to 35 below, possibly lower, before wind chill. Travel, the voice said, may be impossible for an extended period. Mara looked at the stove. The fire was already settling. She looked at the woodshed, 96 feet away. The math was simple and it was merciless. To keep that cabin livable, the stove would have to run all day and all night. In that kind of cold, it would need wood every 2 or 3 hours, not once a day, not when she felt ready. Every few hours, even in darkness, even in wind, even half asleep. She measured the cabin with her eyes. 14 feet by 16. Low ceiling, warped floorboards, one corner for food, one corner for the sleeping bag. If she packed the place with wood, she might store 2 days' worth before she lost the room to move. And the floor already flexed when she walked. A month of wet snow gear and hardwood would put the stove through the joists. She could not bring the winter's fuel inside. She could not cross 96 feet of open clearing 8 times a day in a whiteout. That was when Cole's little courthouse grin came back to her. Needle Creek is yours now. Plenty of quiet, plenty of space to think. Mara stood at the plastic-covered window and watched the first flakes tilt across the yard. No, she whispered, not to the storm, not even to Cole. To the version of herself that still believed a man could write the end of her life and make it official. If the heat could not come to her, she would build a road to the heat. By first light, she was outside with a tire iron, an old handsaw, and a plan that looked insane only if you had better options. The cabin and the woodshed were separated by one open strip of clearing. Mara needed that strip turned into a protected passage. Not warm. Not comfortable, just survivable, a covered corridor, 3 feet wide, high enough to crouch through, strong enough to keep wind from stealing the path and snow from filling it solid. She did not have lumber, she had firewood, so she used the firewood. The design was ugly and brilliant. She stacked 2 parallel walls of cordwood from the cabin porch toward the shed. Each wall braced with fence posts. She scavenged from a fallen corral near the tree line. She drove those posts into the ground with the back of an axe. Across the top she laid lodgepole rails, scrap boards, and anything long enough to span the gap. Then she dragged sheets of rusted metal roofing from behind the shed and wired them down with old fencing wire. The passage would be built from the same fuel that threatened to run out. As the winter deepened, she would burn the inside layers first, leaving the outer shell packed against snow and ice. The corridor would thin as she survived. It would sacrifice itself 1 armload at a time. That was the only kind of miracle Mara trusted, the kind that left splinters. By noon, her palms were torn open. By mid-afternoon, the temperature dropped hard enough that mud turned to iron under her boots. Every post fought her. Every sheet of roofing cut at her coat. The old wire snapped, whipped, and opened thin red lines across her wrists. She worked anyway, 10 feet, 18, 24. The corridor rose behind her in crooked sections, 2 low walls of split wood, with a dark slot between them. It looked less like a hallway than a trench some desperate animal had learned to build. When the wind moved across the clearing, Mara stepped into the unfinished passage and felt the difference. Outside, the gust pushed snow dust sideways. Inside, the air held still. It was working. Not beautifully, not safely, but enough. The next day, her body woke before she did. Her shoulders cramped. Her back pulsed. Her fingers had swollen around the torn skin, and one thumbnail was black where a post had caught it. She boiled coffee so strong it tasted burnt, wrapped her hands in strips cut from a flannel shirt, and went back out. The storm warning had moved up. The worst of it would arrive before midnight. She had 40 feet left. The sky lowered through the afternoon until it pressed on the treetops. The mountains disappeared first, then the ridgeline, then the far pines erased behind a whitening curtain. Mara stopped counting hours. She counted sections, one stack to the next post, one post to the next rail, one rail to the next strip of metal. At the final section, where the passage had to meet the woodshed door, the wind turned vicious. A sheet of roofing lifted in her hands as if it had grown wings. Mara tried to drop her weight onto it, but the gust ripped it upward, tearing wire through her gloves and yanking her forward. Her left boot slipped on frozen ground. She fell hard. The pain came not as a sting, but as a white flash. Something in her right knee twisted wrong and gave way beneath her. For a moment, there was no storm, no cabin, no coal. Just the clean, unbelievable fact that her body had betrayed her with less than 6 feet of roof left to finish. She tried to stand. Her knee folded. She went down again, biting back a scream so hard she tasted blood. The wind had taken the roofing sheet into the dark. The gap above the final section was open. If she left it, the storm would pour through that hole and pack the corridor full before morning. The whole structure would become a coffin-shaped snowdrift. Mara crawled to the shed door. Not walked. Crawled. Her hands dragged over frozen dirt and bark chips. Her bad knee sent heat up her thigh with every inch. Inside the shed she found a roll of black irrigation tarp, stiff with cold and chewed by mice at the edges. She hooked both arms around it and dragged it out. The wind fought her like something alive. It slapped the tarp against her face. It shoved snow into her collar. It flattened her breath until she could only gasp in pieces. Mara hauled herself onto the cordwood wall and pinned the tarp with her chest while her numb fingers twisted wire around a post. Once. Twice. Again. The final knot held. Mara dropped into the passage on the sheltered side just as the storm fully arrived. The clearing vanished. Snow did not fall. It attacked. The cabin was less than 100 feet away, but she could not see it from the shed door. She could only see the dark throat of the passage she had made. She crawled into it. The sound changed immediately. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, it became a low, terrible moan pushing through cracks in the wood. Mara dragged herself through the corridor on her elbows, pulling the bad leg behind her. Snow hissed against the outer walls. The roof bowed. Loose bark scraped her cheek. One stacked log shifted above her with a hollow knock that made her freeze. Then it held. She kept crawling. When she reached the porch, she shoved the cabin door open with her shoulder, rolled inside, and kicked it shut with her good foot. The stove had sunk to embers. Mara fed it 3 pieces of split pine with shaking hands, then collapsed beside it on the floor. Outside, the temperature kept dropping. Inside, the iron began to glow. Mara lay there with snow melting in her hair, blood drying on her wrists, and pain thudding in her knee. She had not escaped the winter. She had only earned the right to fight it indoors. For 22 days, the world beyond Needle Creek disappeared. The radio died on the 4th day when the batteries gave out. After that, there was only the wind, the stove, and the narrow corridor between them. Mara splinted her knee with 2 cedar shingles and a belt. She moved with a broom handle under one arm. Every trip through the passage became a ritual of damage control. Wake, check the stove, melt snow, drink, eat rice or beans, wrap the knee tighter, take the lantern, go into the corridor, pull only from the inner wood layer, return before the tremors got too deep, feed the fire, sleep in pieces. The passage became its own weather. Snow packed against the outside so hard it sealed the gaps and turned the cordwood walls into frozen masonry. Frost hung from the roof seams in glassy teeth. Her breath smoked in the dark slot of air between the walls, but compared to the killing cold outside, it felt almost kind. Almost. Because every day, survival made the structure weaker. Every armload of wood came from the same walls protecting her. Mara learned to choose carefully. Pine from the inner right side in daylight, fir from the inner left side at night. Never two low logs from the same stack. Never pull a piece that made the wall breathe. By the second week, the passage had widened in places like a wound. The posts leaned inward. The roofing sagged under snow. At night, the corridor creaked and settled. Each sound reached the cabin through the porch boards and found Mara in her sleep. On the 23rd morning, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden it woke her. Mara opened her eyes to a blue-gray light at the window, and a cold so complete it felt physical, like a hand closing around the cabin. The stove needed larch, not pine, dense wood, long burn, the kind stacked deep in the back of the shed. She tied the splint tighter, took the lantern, and hobbled through the passage. At the shed door she heard it, a low growl, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to make every living part of her go still. Inside the woodshed, behind the old larch stacks, a gray wolf stood in the shadows. It was thin enough that its ribs showed through the winter coat. One ear was torn. Its eyes were fixed on Mara with the bright, furious panic of an animal that had found shelter and then discovered it was trapped. Mara's hand tightened around the tire iron. The wolf bared its teeth. She could not run. She could not fight well. And if she closed the door and left, she would be burning the corridor walls again by nightfall. For several seconds, woman and animal watched each other over the same pile of wood, both starving in different ways, both cornered by the same winter. Mara lowered the tire iron first. "Not today," she whispered. Her voice sounded thin and strange in the cold. She backed out 1 inch at a time, never turning her shoulders, never taking her eyes off the wolf. Then she pulled the shed door nearly closed and wedged it with a split round, leaving enough space for the animal to force its way out if it chose to. That choice cost her. For 4 more days she lived off the corridor walls. She took wood higher than she should have. She took wood closer to the posts. She listened to the roof settle lower every time she passed beneath it. On the 5th night, a thaw moved through. Not warmth, just a few degrees of mercy. The next morning, she opened the shed door and found the wolf gone. It had torn through a rotten backboard and vanished into the timber. But it had left behind chaos. One of the old larch stacks had collapsed across the back wall. Logs lay scattered over dirt, bark, and something Mara had never seen before because the wood had hidden it for decades. A square metal box. Not an ammo can. Not a toolbox. A rusted blasting powder chest with a brass hasp gone green at the edges. Mara stood over it, breathing hard. There are moments when the body understands before the mind will admit it. This was one of them. She pried at the hasp with the tire iron until the corroded metal gave way. The lid lifted with a dry sigh. Inside were oilcloth bundles, stacked tight. Mara unwrapped the first one and found a small bar of dull yellow metal stamped with a defunct Boise assay mark. Gold, not jewelry, not keepsakes, gold. The second bundle held more bars, smaller but heavier than they looked. The third held canvas pouches filled with coarse placer nuggets and black sand. Beneath them sat a cracked leather ledger wrapped in wax paper, its pages filled with columns of dates, weights, and a name written in a cramped hand. Silas Rusk, Cole's great-grandfather. The prospector no one in Cole's family had cared enough to remember properly. The old man had not left stories, he had left proof. Mara sat on an overturned log with the gold in her lap while cold light came through the broken boards. For weeks, she had been burning the thing that hid her future. One wrong armload from the back stack, and she might have found it sooner. One different storm, and the shed might have collapsed over it forever. One starving wolf, looking for the same shelter she needed, had knocked open the secret Cole had deeded away with a smirk. Mara started laughing. Not because it was funny, because anything else would have broken her. The winter loosened slowly after that. Storms still came, but the deep killing cold began to retreat. Day by day, the snow changed from powder to crust to wet, heavy weight. The corridor that had saved her started to fail. First, the middle sagged. Then one roof panel bent under thawing snow. Then, on an afternoon in late March, the passage collapsed with a long wooden groan and a crash that shook loose frost from the cabin window. Mara watched from the porch, leaning on her broom handle. For 1 second, grief rose in her throat. That ugly corridor had been her road, her shelter, her argument with death. Then she looked past it. The clearing was open enough to cross. The woodshed stood exposed. The season had changed. The road had done its job. By the second week of April, the county road was passable in a few rutted places. Mara wrapped the gold bundles in towels, packed them into an old cooler, and wedged the cooler beneath a blanket on the passenger floor of the Dodge. The truck fought her at first. It coughed, clicked, and complained. Then the engine caught. Mara drove down the mountain at 15 miles an hour. Her bad knee braced against the dashboard, her face thinner than it had been in November, her hands scarred, her hair smelling permanently of smoke. In the town of Elk Fork, she walked into the sheriff's office and set the cooler on the floor. Deputy Marlowe looked up from his desk and stared. "Mara Delaney?" She nodded. He pushed his chair back so fast it hit the wall. "Mom, we tried to reach Needle Creek twice in December. Snowcat couldn't get past the washout." "We thought." "I know what you thought," Mara said. She was too tired to make it gentle. Then she nudged the cooler with her boot. "I need a phone. I need a lawyer who understands mineral property, and I need somebody honest to tell me what old gold is worth." The answer came in stages. A jeweler in town would not touch the valuation. A coin and bullion appraiser in Boise asked 2 questions, then drove up himself. The ledger mattered. The assay marks mattered. The placer gold mattered less than the provenance, but it still mattered plenty. By the end of the month, the collection was valued at just under $940,000 before private sale premiums. Cole heard before Mara called him. Men like Cole always heard money before apology. His first message was calm. His second was not. By the third, he was screaming that the gold belonged to the Rusk family, that Mara had stolen it, that the transfer had never meant buried valuables, that no judge in Idaho would let her keep what was morally his. Cole had forgotten who wrote the divorce decree. His lawyers had drafted it wide on purpose. They wanted to keep Mara from ever claiming hidden accounts, business equipment, or anything still tangled in Cole's name. So they made the language brutal. Cole Rusk relinquished all right, title, interest, claim, or expectation in Needle Creek, including all structures, contents, improvements, stored materials, mineral interests, fixtures, effects, and property located upon, within, or beneath the described parcel, whether known or unknown at the time of transfer. Mara's lawyer read that sentence once and smiled for the first time all morning. In court, Cole tried to look wounded. He said family history had been violated. He said Mara was exploiting an accident. He said no reasonable person would interpret the agreement that broadly. The judge asked if Cole had signed it. Cole said yes. The judge asked if Cole had been represented by counsel. Cole said yes. The judge asked if Cole's counsel had drafted the clause. Cole said nothing. The case was dismissed before lunch, not postponed, not softened, dismissed. Cole left the courthouse with the same expression Mara had worn months earlier, when a piece of paper changed the shape of his life, and there was nothing left to argue with. Mara did not become the kind of rich person Cole would have respected. She did not buy a glass house in the valley. She did not trade the truck for something that looked clean in a driveway. She sold part of the gold through private channels, placed the rest in a secure trust, paid every debt with her name on it, and hired a crew to make Needle Creek livable without making it tame. The old cabin came down plank by plank. The stove was saved. A small off-grid house rose where the cabin had stood, tight against wind, with solar panels angled toward winter sun, a real well, a root cellar, and a stovepipe that drew clean. The woodshed was rebuilt with a straight roof and concrete footings, and between the house and the shed, Mara built one thing before anything else was finished. A covered walkway, not temporary, not desperate. A permanent cedar passage with open sides, a pitched metal roof, and enough width for a wheelbarrow. The workers thought it was practical. Mara knew it was a monument. On the first anniversary of the day, Cole handed her the deed. Mara stood on the porch with coffee in both hands because she liked the weight of a full mug now. The morning air was sharp, but not cruel. New snow dusted the roof of the walkway. Beyond it, the woodshed door stood open, stacked neatly for winter. She looked at the path, at the house, at the ridge where the storm had erased the world and failed to erase her. Cole had sent her to Needle Creek, believing it was a dead end. Mara had made it a door,